It's really interesting just how controversial modern monetary theory is. The strength of feeling on both sides of the debate is remarkable. Some of you have told me that I don't understand it, and it's definitely the case that the fiscal and monetary system is complex. It's easy to gloss over the detail when making YouTube videos. I've been digging a bit deeper, studying people like Randall Wray and Stephanie Kelton, and this has helped me get a bit more beneath the surface of MMT. I wouldn't claim to have all the answers, but I am understanding some of the points that baffled me a bit previously. So in this video, I want to share 10 true things about MMT, why they sound so counterintuitive, what the main objections are, and why, once you dig deeper, they actually are true. So here are 10 true things about modern monetary theory. 1. A government that issues its own currency cannot run out of money. We're told endlessly that governments can't afford things, that we have to tolerate a failing country because we can't afford it. But here's the fact. For a government that issues its own currency, like the UK or the US, it literally cannot run out of money. It can always create more. Now, I know this sounds just too good to be true, and it goes against what most of us have been taught in our economics degrees. Most people's reaction to this is that it's plain irresponsible to merely create money. People fear that admitting to this technical truth would become a license to make money and spend recklessly. At this point, it is worth saying that this isn't some radical new discovery by MMT. Ever since money stopped being tied to gold in the 1970s, governments that issue their own currency have had the capacity to create as much of it as they need. And in times of crisis, whether through quantitative easing after 2008 or the emergency programs during the pandemic, the bank has already literally created new money to keep the system afloat. What MMT does is bring this reality out into the open, stripping away the claims that make it sound otherwise. Now, how governments use the freedom to create money does matter. MMT is not claiming that there's a magic money tree, that unlimited spending is possible. There are real constraints. More of that later. 2. The government does not need to tax or borrow in order to spend. Most people believe taxes and borrowing fund government spending. That's the orthodox story. But MMT flips it. Governments that issue their own currency don't need revenue before they can spend. In reality, spending creates the money first. Taxes and borrowing come afterwards to balance the system and control inflation. The key point is that from a technical standpoint, the government does not need revenue to spend. It can create the money. The revenue comes later. People object to this, saying, but surely governments need to raise revenue before they can spend. That's just common sense. There is a technical sense in which it looks that way under the system as it currently operates. In the UK, for example, the government's account at the Bank of England must be balanced at the end of each day, which is why bonds are issued on a rolling basis. The US has its own equivalent rules, but these are operational conventions, not economic necessities. They don't change the underlying reality. Government spending injects money into the economy first. Taxes and borrowing are used afterwards to manage that money. 3. Government deficits are not to be feared. In mainstream economics, the word deficit is almost always perceived as negative. It sounds like debt, overspending, recklessness, but MMT flips the perspective. The first and most important point is that a government deficit is not like household debt. If I borrow money, I need to earn income to pay it back. But a government that issues its own currency never faces that problem. It can always create the money to cover its obligations. That's why the deficit number itself is not a sign of danger. The real question is whether the spending is pushing the economy beyond its productive capacity and into inflation. More of that later. There's also a second point, which is about accounting, but which is crucial for understanding how MMT reframes the word deficit. A government deficit is always matched by a surplus somewhere else. If the government spends more than it taxes, that extra money shows up in the private sector, in households and businesses' accounts. Some of it may be saved, some of it spent. Either way, the private sector ends up better off. That's why deficits are not a black hole dragging the economy down. They strengthen private balance sheets and support higher demand. I can understand that people instinctively push back at this point. Isn't living beyond your means dangerous? Shouldn't governments balance the books like families do? It almost feels unbelievable that the rules for a government could be so different. But the reality is that deficits are not inherently dangerous. What matters is whether government spending is pushing the economy beyond its real capacity, not whether the books are in balance. And even when there is a deficit, that simply means government is putting more money into the economy than it's taking out, which often helps keep the economy afloat. What MMT does here is reframe the word deficit. Put another way, a government deficit will always show up as a surplus somewhere in the private sector. 4. MMT is not a magic money tree. The real limit is inflation. Many people criticise MMT as a kind of magic money tree, the idea that governments can spend without limit. I can understand why people might think that. At first glance it sounds too good to be true. But MMT is not saying this at all. It's saying that there are real constraints on government creating money to finance spending. But these constraints come from the capacity of the economy, not from the size of the deficit. The key point is that the true limit on spending is inflation. If too much money chases too few goods, you get price rises. That's the break. Budget deficits themselves are not the problem, inflation is. If the government creates money, it should invest it wisely in things that expand the economy's productive capacity: infrastructure, healthcare, education, green energy. The sceptical question is, but what if governments just waste money on vanity projects or giveaways? And that's a fair worry. Bad spending that doesn't expand capacity does risk creating inflation. But that doesn't disprove the point. It shows why the focus must be on using spending to increase what the economy can actually produce. So yes, MMT is correct. New money creation should be tied to building capacity, not to arbitrary budget limits. The danger isn't that governments will run out of money. They can't. The real danger is wasting that power on spending that doesn't expand the economy's ability to produce. That's why the real break is inflation, not the size of the deficit. 5. Taxes and bonds are policy tools, not funding mechanisms. Taxes and bonds are not required to fund spending. So what do they actually do? They're essential for keeping the system stable. Taxes withdraw money from circulation, helping to prevent the economy from overheating and keeping inflation under control. They also let governments influence distribution, deciding who has more or less spending power. Through redistribution, taxes can be used to reduce inequality. Bonds, meanwhile, give savers a safe place to park their money and provide a tool for managing interest rates. When the government issues bonds, it isn't because it needs the money. It's offering investors a secure asset and fine-tuning financial conditions. So yes, taxes and bonds matter, but not because the government requires them to spend. They're tools for managing inflation, stability and fairness after the money has already been created through spending. 6. Balanced budgets are a political choice, not a law of nature. People often assume governments must balance the books, just like households. In the UK, for example, the Treasury's account at the Bank of England legally can't be left overdrawn at the end of the day. On the surface, that makes it look as though the government has to tax or borrow before it spends. But this is an operational rule, not an economic necessity. The UK suspended it during COVID. The US has its own debt ceiling, but that too is a political device. These are accounting conventions that can be and are relaxed in emergencies. So a balanced budget is not some universal law of economics. It's a political preference dressed up as a necessity. To the extent it's written in law, the government could change the law. 7. Markets and perception matter. Even if balanced budgets are a political choice, markets don't always see it that way. Investors act as though the old orthodoxy still applies, that deficits are dangerous and governments can run out of money. The result is that confidence becomes critical. If markets believe a government is being reckless, they may sell the currency and dump government bonds. That combination can push up bond yields, drive down the exchange rate and trigger inflationary pressures, even if technically the government can never run out of money. This is exactly what happened during Liz Truss's mini-budget in 2022. It wasn't that the UK had suddenly become insolvent, it hadn't. What collapsed was market confidence. The pound fell, bond yields spiked, and the Bank of England had to step in. And here's the crucial point. Even from an MMT perspective, Truss's tax cuts were bad policy. They weren't targeted at boosting the UK's productive capacity. They were giveaways to the wealthy, money injected at the top that was unlikely to generate real growth, but very likely to fuel inflationary pressure. So while MMT is right about the mechanics, perception still matters, and this shows a deeper problem. Until markets shift their understanding to recognise that the true limit is inflation, not deficits, governments will remain hostage to old ideas and the market reactions those ideas trigger. 8. The real controversy is political, not technical. MMT has been around since the early 1990s. If it's correct in its description of how government finance actually works, why hasn't it been accepted? The mechanics of MMT are well understood by central bankers. The Bank of England itself has published papers explaining that government spending comes first, with taxes and borrowing following after. The resistance isn't about economics, it's about politics. Why is this? I think the answer is that if people understood MMT, the whole argument of we can't afford it would collapse. Neoliberal economics leans heavily on the household analogy and the idea of scarcity to justify austerity and cuts. MMT shows that those arguments are ideological, not technical, and that's the real problem. Once you accept MMT, austerity is exposed as a political choice, not an economic necessity. It also undermines the case for small government, since the affordability excuse disappears. For those committed to shrinking the state, MMT is politically toxic because it opens the door to ambitious public investment. So the controversy is not about whether MMT is correct, it's about whether we're willing to admit what it implies for politics. 9. The weak link, politicians themselves. If all of the previous points on MMT are correct, and I think it's pretty indisputable that they are, then the big question becomes, can politicians be trusted to use this power responsibly? The instinctive reaction is, come on, these people can't even run the NHS or a train service, and you want them to manage inflation by creating money? And that's fair. MMT assumes governments can spend responsibly and rein in demand when needed. In theory, that's true. In practice, it depends on whether politicians have the will and the competence to act wisely. And frankly, that's not guaranteed. So the principle is sound, but the politics remain the sticking point. The mistaken constraint of budget deficits has at least functioned as a brake, perhaps, preventing reckless politicians from going too far. That's exactly what happened with Liz Truss. The market stepped in and imposed some discipline. But it's absurd to defend a false understanding of economics just because our politicians aren't up to the job. Surely the better answer is to demand better politicians, not worse economics. 10. The economy isn't a simple machine. MMT is often described as though it gives governments precise control. Spend until you hit capacity, then tax to cool things down. In reality, one argument that does have some weight is that the economy is too complex for that kind of calibration. Inflationary limits can't simply be represented in a single aggregate number. They're likely to vary sector by sector. So if the government ramps up construction spending while the building industry is already stretched, you'll get price and wage inflation there, even if unemployment still exists elsewhere. And unexpected shocks, from energy prices to supply chains, can trigger inflation long before anyone notices the aggregate economy is at full capacity. So while MMT is right that governments can always create money, the practical challenge is knowing how much is too much and when. That's messy and uncertain. The orthodox rule that spending must be funded has at least acted as a crude brake, forcing governments to make trade-offs. But again, is the answer really to cling to a false story about how money works just because reality is complicated? Surely it makes more sense to be honest about the mechanics and then focus on building the institutions and judgment we need to navigate that complexity. So in conclusion, where does this leave us? MMT is not a free-for-all. It isn't a magic money tree. What it does is strip away the myths that government are like households, that taxes fund spending, and that deficits are inherently dangerous. It reminds us that in a modern economy, the real limits are inflation and productive capacity, not a lack of money. That doesn't mean governments can do whatever they like. It means they have more room to manoeuvre than orthodox economics admits. The real challenge is twofold, political and practical. First, can our politicians be trusted to use this power responsibly rather than recklessly? And second, can we develop the judgment and institutions to handle the complexity of economy that is never as simple as a textbook model? But on the economics, one thing is clear. MMT describes how money already works. Whether we admit it or not, governments spend first and tax later. Deficits create private surpluses. The danger isn't running out of money, it's what we choose to do or fail to do with the money we can always create. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. I'd really appreciate that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.